did developmental psychopathology start? We're in our 30-year anniversary, when in 1984, Child Development, the long-standing, venerable, best journal in the field of human science on children and their development, published a special section, a few articles, on this thing called developmental psychopathology. And in it, the people who started to write about it said, look, developmental psychology, Piaget, Vygotsky, etc., they're looking at the whole population and looking for laws and trends. On the other hand, child psychology, child clinical psychology, child psychiatry is looking for categories of kids with problems. But the two fields are like light years apart. What if we put it together? What if we said, maybe kids don't get born with a disorder, but something in these developmental curves and trajectories in a subset of kids gets deflected. They don't reach their potential. Maybe it's a lack of skills, maybe it's a lack of environmental sensitivity, but we can't know much about what goes wrong until we know what goes right, and if we know about what goes wrong, that'll help inform us about what goes right. So developmental psychopathology is a 30-year-old field or subfield or discipline or perspective, and what we're going to talk about for the rest of today is big principles. Now, you'll think, oh God, is this really boring? It may be today, but I don't think it will be by the time the course is over. So, the first principle is one I just mentioned. The idea is you can't know about ADHD until you know about the normal development of attention and impulse control. You just can't do it. You can't know about a learning disability until you know the normative process of how kids learn. And if you really study carefully kids with ADHD, that won't only teach you how to help them, but it might teach you about how attention normally develops. So the information goes both ways. Only by knowing the normative can you understand the atypical, and if you really study the atypical carefully, it will inform you about the normative. So this is sort of highfalutin chalk talk. So what happened in neurology? Neurology is sort of a poster child for this way of thinking. So in the 1950s, H.M., as he was known until he just died recently, a couple of years ago, and now his name has been revealed, was a young man in Canada who'd been born in the very early 1930s, and as a teenager and as a young adult, he developed a pattern of grand mal seizures that almost killed him. He couldn't function. He would have a seizure or two every day. And the doctors at the time, without modern brain scanning, said, well, we think from EEGs we've located the seizure somewhere deep in there, and they did they opened up his skull, and they did pretty radical surgery and took out part of his brain that I'll describe in a minute, and he stopped having seizures. But what began then for the rest of his life, if you know the case of H.M. from other courses? What happened? Anybody? Yes? They took out both the right and left main section of his hippocampus. So what was his life like after that? He could remember things for how long? About 15 seconds. He remembered deep stuff in storage, but he could not consolidate any short-term memory into long-term memory for the rest of his life. So this became a very famous case study. It turns out that he actually could remember things, but he didn't know he could remember things. Started the field of implicit memory. We don't have time to get into it. But here's the idea. By studying this very unfortunate case study of very atypical behavior, the seizures were intractable, the seizure stopped, but by then later saying, oh, we know what part of the brain had been spliced, and then we look at the maladaptation in its functioning, that taught us that if you don't have a fully functioning hippocampus, you don't have a good chance at all of consolidating what I just said and remembering it past the end of my next sentence. So studying the atypical in this case really informed neurology about, my God, short-term memory, long-term memory, consolidation, parts of the brain that are necessary for it. So it's an interesting concept. Now, this is a single case and a single part of the brain, and it's pretty clear. What about autism? It's pretty complicated. What about childhood depression? Pretty complicated. Is it as simple as, if we really understand autism, then we know about how everybody forms social connectedness and empathy? Maybe not quite as simple as in neurology, but the idea is, that's the prototype. We have to know everything about normal development to help us understand the atypical, and maybe studying people who are way beyond the norm, if we do it really well and carefully, it's going to feed back and inform the normal developmental science about what's happening in general. That's the idea. That's the concept. So with autism, just to be specific and concrete for a second, one theory is that people with autism or autistic disorder lack a certain pretty specific thing, which used to be called perspective taking, and today is called theory of mind. It's the idea that if I picked on any one of you right now, maybe you're not exactly thinking what I'm thinking. Maybe you've got a different perspective on things. And if I don't get that, I go through life fairly self-focused, and I don't really get you and your emotions and your thoughts and who you are. And so if we could figure out from the study of people with autism why they don't lack this sort of isolated yet vital skill of getting perspective on others, or the theory that other people have different minds, that may tell us about how everybody develops empathy and theory of mind. So ADHD, I mentioned this a minute ago. Maybe if we study kids who really can't focus, or are really distractible, or can't restrain an impulse, just feels so good, I've got to do it, even though if I thought about it, the consequences would make me not do it, maybe that will help teach us about how everybody learns to delay gratification. We'll talk a lot in a few weeks about aggressive behavior. Conduct disorder is the sort of fancy psychiatric term for it. But the idea is what? Who are the most aggressive people in the human species? 1.5 and 2-year-old boys, by far. Just watch and just count their behaviors. Girls aren't too far behind at that age. If you're not fairly aggressive at that age and saying mine and grabbing things from people and gouging other kids' eyes out with your toys, there's a problem. Maybe you're not developing a sense of self. But the vast majority of kids in the next several years learn to cool their jets. They learn self-regulation. They learn that you've got to share, all those kinds of things. So in some ways, the study of conduct disorder and aggression isn't the study of why do some 8-year-olds really get aggressive. It's the study of why do a few kids fail to learn how to inhibit themselves. It throws the tables around about normal development, and it's not, again, that you're developing aggression, but you fail to develop the inhibitory controls on the aggression that just about all 2-year-olds normatively show. So that's what this first point means. The mutual interplay between what's going right and usually in the norm and what's going wrong when things are bad, and how those two perspectives inform each other. So, another big principle, continuities, discontinuities. There's two meanings here. Number one, is autism just the extreme of being male? I mean, if I'm a male, I think in categories, and I don't give too much of a damn about what you feel because I've got a goal. And this is one of the theories of autism, it's extreme maleness. So are people labeled with autism just at the end of extreme maleness, or is it a separate category? Are there genes or developmental experiences that put you're really not just at the end of the bell curve, you're in a separate category? This is the big question. You could ask it for ADHD, you could ask it for learning disabilities, you could ask it for schizophrenia. Most of the evidence suggests these days that what we think of as categories here in the DSM label of autistic disorder or autism maybe are really just at the end of a continuum. It's a big question. Here's the second meaning. Not about groups of people, but about a given person over time. So if you've taken developmental psych, or you remember from your high school psych class, what did Piaget say? 0 to 2 sensory motor, then you go into pre-operation. You shift. You have actually a discontinuity in the way you perceive the world. It's not just linear. So is this true for psychopathology? Do you wake up one day at 2 and you're really aggressive and stay that way, or do you go through stages and phases? Is it discontinuous? Now here's some terms we'll talk about in a couple weeks, but I want to introduce them now. If you think things are continuous, one kind of continuity would be called homotypic continuity. We're going to observe 5-year-olds, and it turns out that some of them don't feel their life is worth living, actually feel suicidal, have trouble sleeping, and feel sad a lot. And at 5 and at 10 and at 15 and 20, that's kind of a continuity of those depressive symptoms. The same things at age 5 are predicting the same things at age 10, 15, 20. But maybe there's a different type of continuity that's trickier. Maybe you can predict a kid's depression, now they're an adult at 25, but you don't predict it from the same symptoms at age 5. There's a continuity, but the continuity changes in form over time. So we'll talk about this in about 6 or 7 weeks. The most aggressive kids, who turn out to be the very most aggressive or psychopathic adults, have a lot of tantrums when they're young, start to swear at their preschool teachers, steal from their 2nd grade teachers, get into physical fights in 5th grade, sexually assault girls in middle school, and exhibit partner violence in their 20s. Well, that's not continuous because they're not tantruming in their 20s. Or is it continuous? Maybe there's a kind of antisocial tendency that exhibits itself really differently across the ages. So why would a tantrum parlay into swearing, parlay into stealing, and into partner violence? There's a continuity there, but there's something deeper. There's a trait that unfolds in interaction with the environment that changes the form of it. This will be a quick one, point number 3. If you're interested in developmental psychopathology, we know a lot about genes now. Since 2001, we basically unraveled the human genomic code. We know where all 3 billion base pairs of the amino acids and their building blocks are in the nucleotides in every cell, in every nucleus in our body. But those genes create what? Proteins. And proteins make up things called neurotransmitters and muscle, and they build a body, and the body behaves. But humans, like all primates, are really social, and we couldn't survive unless we had families and neighborhoods and then later schools to help us learn, all the way to culture, all the way to the world. Where are you interested? Are you into sociology and anthropology? Are you a geneticist? The challenge of developmental psychopathology is, how do you span across? How does a genetic abnormality or a genetic difference interact with the family environment to create difficulties at school? Or how does culture 1 glorify or amplify good traits that culture 2 suppresses? So you can go bottom up or you can go top down. The name of the game in developmental psychopathology today is you've got to be interested in multiple levels of analysis. If you're only interested in one, that's great, you become a specialist in that, but to understand abnormal behavior, you're probably going to have to span, maybe not the whole way from genes to cultures, but some subset. So point 4 is related. We know we're in the biological era, the decade of the brain 2 decades ago, brain science thriving. But brains don't develop in isolation. Brains need stimulation. They need social stimulation. Vygotsky said you can't learn without people around you, the zone of proximal development, if you've ever studied that. Brain science now knows that, thinks it knows that. Fairly recent stuff, pretty interesting. Why is the human brain as big as it is? And why is the cortex so densely interconnected? Why is the human brain in some ways unique? Tool building? Fire? The theorists today suggest that the human brain is the way it is because of all of us. The human brain went through evolutionary pressure to evolve this big frontal lobe and this densely impacted connected cortex because we've got to learn so much about other people. It's a phenomenal thing. We can't learn without others. We can't survive without them. We grow up a little bit. You got to negotiate a school and who's a peer, who's on your side or who's not. Or now you're in a nation. Is it a warring nation or a peaceful nation? A lot of the computational power of our brain may be because of how social we are as a species. So brain development isn't just in a test tube. It's in a very dense social and cultural context. So ADHD, our lab studies it a lot. Is ADHD something you can isolate in a brain scan, or can you only understand it by understanding that certain kids and certain styles of attention or impulse control don't fit in certain schools? So it's not just the biology, it's not just the culture, it's how they come together. So this is kind of point 4 is a special case of the multiple levels of analysis. You'll hear this a lot, point 5. Reciprocal models and transactional models. So what's a reciprocal model? I'm a new parent, and I've got a kid who decides not to sleep, but I'm tired. So do I stuff milk into their mouth, or do I sing lullabies, and they're still up, and what am I going to do? And my arm gets sore from rocking them, and I get frustrated. So am I a frustrated parent, or was my frustration elicited by the kid's behavior? Well, the answer is yes, both of the above. So a reciprocal model is the child is influencing, in this case, the parent, and the parent in turn is influencing the child, and hard to tell which is which. And if those reciprocal models, A causes B and B causes A, spiral over time, now we're into transaction. Maybe there's certain kids who are harder to raise than others. Or maybe there's certain parents who shouldn't be parents and have a tougher time parenting. But they may create kids who get that and start to fight back. And now you get a transaction, repeated reciprocal influences over time. This is important because A, it's probably reality, and B, it's hard to study this. It's hard to study this in the methods of Psych 101. You can't do a t-test a million times over life, or even an analysis of variance. It's a reciprocal model that requires a different way of thinking about it. 6th big point in developmental psychopathology. We want to know what causes autism. We want to know what causes a kid to have a reading disorder. Well, cause is a big word. We can't randomly assign some kids to get abused or not. We can't randomly assign people to have a certain kind of gene or not. But we can study risk. Something that goes before the problem, and it's correlated with that problem. So that's what a risk factor is. But as we'll talk about, there's a lot of risk factors for all of these categories of mental illness, and they're very connected. But what we'd really like to know is, okay, I had maltreatment as a kid. I grew up in a family with mental illness. I grew up in a poor neighborhood. All of those are risk factors. Is there something that comes after the risk, but before the bad outcome to protect me? That's known as resilience. Something that can mitigate risk, something that can undo the harmful effects of a risk factor. So resilience is the study of how risk factors and protective factors come together and cause at least a subset of kids to defy the odds, to do better than expected. I will leave you today with two concepts we're going to come back to several times. If you've bought points 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, what's the case? There's probably a lot of different reasons as to why Jose at age 10 has ADHD. Maybe he was born with certain genes in a different configuration. Maybe he had parents that weren't quite responsive enough. Maybe he's been in schools that... What's equifinality? There may be many different pathways leading to what looks like the same condition. Many arrows pointing at, developmentally, a certain outcome. And what's the flip side of that? Let's go back earlier in time. Let's talk about kids who've been maltreated or abused. Some become aggressive if they become physically abused. Some may actually become quite sensitive, and caregivers, because they know what to look for in the environment, they develop more empathy. The same risk factor maltreatment may predict very unhealthy or very healthy outcomes. That's multi-finality. The same early condition or risk may spiral out to different outcomes depending on what? Depending on other biological factors, depending on the response of parents, depending on the response of the culture. What's all this mean? Nothing in this course is simple or linear. If you like things in nice, neat little boxes, we'll see you in engineering, okay? This is a course about uncertainty, but it's really fascinating. So we'll see you Monday. Take care.